You've seen this face before, even if you've never set foot inside a cathedral, even if you couldn't tell a relic from a rumor. That faint, ghostly figure stretched across an old sheet of linen, the bearded man, the closed eyes, the strange, sorrowful stillness of an image that seems to float just above the surface of the cloth rather than sit on top of it. It's appeared on documentaries, magazine covers, and museum posters for well over a century now, and it remains one of the most intensively studied objects in the history of both science and religion. And here's the part that doesn't always make it into the popular retelling. When researchers finally sequenced the genetic material trapped inside its fibers, actual DNA pulled from the dust caught in centuries of woven thread, the results didn't hand either side of this debate a clean win. They didn't prove it was Jesus's burial shroud, and they didn't prove it was a medieval forgery either. What came back was something considerably stranger. Genetic traces linked to people from multiple regions across Europe, the Near East, North Africa, and the Indian subcontinent, all recovered from a single, closely guarded piece of cloth. That result is worth sitting with carefully, because understanding what it actually means, and just as importantly, what it doesn't mean, is a lot more interesting than picking a side. Before going further, it's worth being upfront about something, because this particular subject attracts more overheated claims than almost any other object on the internet. This isn't a story about a hidden secret. Nobody is suppressing anything here. There's no locked vault, no buried report, no whistleblower waiting in the wings. If anything, the opposite is true. The Shroud of Turin is arguably one of the most openly and repeatedly tested objects on Earth. It's been photographed, X-rayed, scanned under ultraviolet and infrared light, examined under powerful microscopes, sampled, swabbed, and most recently, sequenced. Believers have studied it. Committed skeptics have studied it. Entire academic careers have been built around it. And the genuinely striking thing is that almost every time a new test runs, hoping to finally settle the question for good, the result ends up complicating the picture the previous test left behind rather than simplifying it. Start with the object itself, not the legend surrounding it, just the physical thing. Picture a strip of linen roughly 14 feet long and a little over 3.5 feet wide, woven in a herringbone pattern and aged to the color of weak tea. Today it's kept in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy, sealed inside a climate-controlled case and brought out for public viewing only rarely, sometimes decades apart. Laid flat, it shows something genuinely eerie. The faint impression of a man, appearing twice, front and back, head to head, as though the cloth had been laid beneath a body, drawn up and over the head, and folded back down along the front. The figure is tall, bearded, hands crossed low over the body, and covered in wounds that researchers have examined in painstaking detail over the decades. Around the scalp and forehead sit dozens of small puncture marks, scattered in a pattern more consistent with something sharp pressed down across the entire head, rather than a neat band across the brow. There are wounds through the wrists and feet, a large wound on the right side of the chest consistent with a blade or spear, and across the back, shoulders, and legs, more than 100 small dumbbell-shaped marks that closely match the pattern left by a Roman flagrum, a whip fitted with small weighted pieces of metal or bone. Whatever this cloth turns out to be, the marks on it depict a specific, brutal, methodical execution. What genuinely stops researchers is how that image is actually formed. Under magnification, there's no paint sitting on top of the threads, and no dye soaked into them the way pigment normally behaves on fabric. Instead, only the very topmost fibers of the linen, the outermost layer, show any chemical alteration at all, subtly discolored and dehydrated in a way that resembles a very faint scorch that never actually burned anything. Multiple analyses conducted by the Shroud of Turin research project in the late 1970s, a team of American scientists given rare direct access to the cloth, found that this discoloration sits in a layer only a few hundred nanometers thick, a tiny fraction of the width of a single human hair. That's an extraordinarily difficult effect to produce with a brush, and one that remains genuinely difficult to reproduce deliberately even with modern tools. The cloth's documented history is part of the puzzle too. It steps clearly into the recorded historical record around 1353, in the hands of a French knight named Geoffroy de Charny, who displayed it at a small church in the village of Lirey. From that point forward, its paper trail is well documented. It passes through noble hands, survives a fire in the 1500s, whose scorch marks and patch repairs are still visible today, and eventually arrives in Turin in 1578, where it has remained ever since. What's notably absent is any comparably solid documentation covering the roughly 13 centuries before 1353, assuming the cloth is as old as some believe, a long stretch where the historical record thins into fragments, legend, and disputed references. Skeptics point directly at that gap as the simplest explanation available. A medieval object with a medieval debut. It's also worth knowing that the Catholic Church itself, the institution actually responsible for the cloth, has never officially declared it authentic. It has also never declared it a forgery. Officially, it's treated as an icon, an object intended for reflection, with the underlying question left deliberately open. So there's a cloth, a wounded figure that wasn't painted on in any conventional sense, and a paper trail that begins firmly in medieval France while dissolving into uncertainty before that. Then, in 1898, an amateur photographer named Secondo Pia, a lawyer and city councilman with a serious interest in the still-new technology of photography, was given rare permission to properly photograph the shroud during a public exhibition. Working with a large, slow glass plate camera under poor cathedral lighting, his first attempt failed. On the evening of May 28, he tried again, exposing a glass negative for several long minutes. When he developed that plate in his darkroom, watching the image slowly emerge under dim red safe light, what appeared wasn't the faint, blurry impression visible on the actual cloth. It was a clear, dimensionally coherent face, serene and lifelike, with far more visible depth and realism than the shroud itself shows to the naked eye. By most accounts, Pia was startled enough by what he saw that he very nearly dropped the plate. The reason that moment mattered so much is technical rather than mystical. The image on the cloth itself reads, in a strange sense, tonally reversed compared to a normal photograph, with light and dark distributed the way they'd appear on a photographic negative rather than the way an ordinary painted portrait would look. When Pia photographed it and then developed that photograph, the negative of a negative produced something closer to a natural, correctly toned positive image. That property, sometimes described as the image carrying negative-like tonal information, is genuinely one of the most discussed technical puzzles connected to the shroud, since it implies whoever or whatever produced the original image encoded light and shadow in a way that only makes visual sense once run through a specific optical process that wasn't formally understood or available until centuries after the cloth's earliest confirmed appearance. That single photograph effectively launched the modern scientific study of the shroud. Before Pia, it was primarily a religious relic, debated mostly by theologians and historians. After Pia, it became something closer to an open scientific problem, drawing in chemists, physicists, and forensic imaging specialists over the following century. Researchers brought X-ray imaging to look for an underdrawing, the kind of preliminary sketch a forger working with paint would typically lay down first, and reportedly found none. They used ultraviolet light, which tends to make many pigments and residues fluoresce visibly, and found the image didn't behave the way known pigments do under that light. They used infrared imaging, spectroscopy, and increasingly powerful microscopy capable of examining individual linen fibers. Across all of it, the same basic frustrating pattern held. No detectable paint, no dye, none of the directional brushstroke evidence or pigment penetration you'd expect from any conventional method of applying an image to fabric, just that extraordinarily thin, chemically altered surface layer. If the image itself is one genuinely open scientific question, the second major flashpoint in the shroud's modern history is its age, and this is where most people's understanding of the object actually begins and ends. In 1988, after years of negotiation, a small sample was finally cut from one corner of the cloth specifically for radiocarbon dating, the standard method used to estimate the age of organic material by measuring the decay of carbon-14. The sample was divided and sent to 3 independent laboratories, in Switzerland, England, and the United States, chosen deliberately so no single lab could skew the result. All 3 came back in close agreement, pointing to a date range of roughly 1260 to 1390, squarely within the medieval period and closely matching the cloth's documented debut in France. For a huge number of people, that result effectively closed the case. a medieval object, radiocarbon dated to the medieval period, case closed. It's a real, carefully conducted result from 3 reputable, independent laboratories, and it deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed simply because it's inconvenient for anyone hoping the cloth is ancient. But it hasn't actually settled the question, and not primarily because of pushback from religious believers. Serious researchers, including some with no particular investment in proving the shroud authentic, have raised genuine technical concerns about that specific sample. It wasn't cut from the center of the body image or from pristine linen deep within the cloth. It came from a corner along the very edge, precisely the kind of location that would have been repeatedly handled, gripped, and potentially repaired across 6 centuries of public display, processions, and restoration work. Some researchers, most notably the chemist Raymond Rogers, who had worked directly with the original 1978 research team, later argued that this specific corner showed signs consistent with a medieval reweave, meaning newer thread may have been skillfully rewoven into the older fabric at some point to repair damage, blending in almost invisibly to the naked eye. If that reweave theory is correct, the 1988 sample wouldn't represent the cloth's true age at all, but some blended average between much older original fibers and considerably newer repair thread, which would tend to pull an ancient cloth's measured date forward into a more recent range without making a genuinely medieval cloth look any older than it actually is. This remains a genuinely contested question. Some researchers who've re-examined the statistical spread across the 3 original 1988 results argue there's a subtle inconsistency suggesting the sampled material wasn't perfectly uniform. Other researchers looking at the same data conclude the variation falls well within normal expected scatter and see no real problem. It's an honest, ongoing scientific disagreement rather than a settled dispute either side can claim outright. If that were the whole story, you'd be left with a fairly typical stalemate, a medieval radiocarbon date some researchers don't fully trust, and an image nobody has managed to convincingly reproduce. But the story shifted again once a different team of researchers stopped focusing on when the cloth was made and started asking where it had actually traveled, and answering that question meant looking not at the image or a single carbon sample, but at the accumulated dust, pollen, and genetic material embedded in the weave itself. That work is most closely associated with Gianni Barcaccia, a geneticist at the University of Padua in Italy, and his research collaborators. In a study published in the journal Scientific Reports in 2015, the team extracted DNA from dust vacuumed off the shroud, including material collected near the body image and from the edge sample during the 1988 radiocarbon testing, and ran it through next-generation sequencing technology, the same broad category of tool used to study ancient human migration patterns. They recovered plant DNA connected to species native to the Mediterranean region alongside others originating in Asia, the Middle East, and even the Americas, some clearly introduced well after the medieval period. On the human side, they identified mitochondrial DNA sequences clustering into several distinct genetic lineages, including ones typically associated with Western Europe, the Near East, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Indian subcontinent. A follow-up study, expanded further in more recent years using more comprehensive metagenomic sequencing of the same 1978 sample collection, confirmed that same broad pattern, describing what the researchers themselves called a diverse genetic mosaic accumulated across the cloth's long-documented history. Here's where it's important to slow down and be precise about what the researchers who actually ran these studies say their own results mean, because it's genuinely more careful and more interesting than DNA proves the shroud traveled the ancient world. Barcaccia and his colleagues have been explicit that this genetic diversity doesn't rule out a medieval European origin, and doesn't confirm an authentic first-century origin either. In their own words from the original 2015 paper, the diversity they found is compatible with several different explanations, including centuries of handling by people from many different backgrounds during public exhibitions, religious processions, restoration work, and, notably, direct contact with the researchers, conservators, and sample collectors who have handled the cloth in relatively modern times. Other scientists reviewing the same body of DNA research, including geneticists interviewed by outlets like Scientific American following the more recent expanded study, have been considerably more blunt, cautioning that the metagenomic methods involved are genuinely prone to false positives and contamination, and that recovering a mosaic of human and even household DNA, researchers also identified genetic traces from cats, dogs, and common food crops on the same samples, says a great deal about centuries of human handling and comparatively little about the cloth's specific geographic origin or age. Barkachia himself, when asked directly what the findings meant for the shroud's authenticity, has been quoted saying plainly that the results don't allow researchers to say much more about its true origin beyond confirming an extensive, complicated history of contact with people from many regions. That distinction matters enormously, because it's the difference between a real, published, peer-reviewed scientific finding and a much more dramatic internet retelling of that finding. The actual documented result is this. DNA recovered from the shroud's dust reflects genetic contributions from people connected to multiple distinct geographic regions across the cloth's long, well-documented history of public handling. What that finding does not do is confirm the cloth's age, its geographic origin, or its authenticity one way or the other, and the scientists who generated the data have said so themselves, repeatedly and on the record. It's worth mentioning two other pieces of evidence that regularly come up in shroud discussions, because they add real texture to the story while also illustrating exactly how contested this field remains. Decades before the DNA studies, a Swiss criminologist named Max Free examined pollen grains he collected from the cloth surface using adhesive tape, and reported identifying dozens of plant species, a number of which he argued were native not to Europe but specifically to the Middle East and Anatolia, including some species he claimed grow only in a narrow band of land between Jerusalem and the Jordan Valley. It's a genuinely evocative claim, and it's been repeated constantly in shroud literature ever since. But it also deserves an important caveat that often gets left out. Free's broader scientific credibility took a serious hit later in his career when he was one of the experts who mistakenly authenticated the forged Hitler diaries in the early 1980s, and independent researchers who later tried to verify his shroud pollen samples have raised real concerns about contamination and methodology. Pollen evidence, as a category, travels easily, clings to almost anything, and is notoriously difficult to definitively source. So while the pollen claims remain part of the broader conversation around the shroud, they carry considerably more uncertainty than the DNA sequencing work does. The blood evidence is on somewhat firmer footing. Multiple independent researchers, including the forensic pathologist Pier Luigi Bema Bologna in the 1980s, examined the dark stains on the cloth and concluded they were consistent with genuine human blood rather than pigment, reporting elevated markers associated with severe physical trauma, though there's been real disagreement over the decades about the specific blood type involved, with some researchers reporting type AB rather than type A. That blood analysis work, alongside the DNA sequencing, connects to one more thread worth mentioning. A disputed but genuinely intriguing historical theory tracing a cloth bearing a face, not made by human hands, back through Byzantine sources describing an object called the Mandi lion, kept in the ancient city of Edessa in what's now southeastern Turkey, before it reportedly moved to Constantinople and then disappeared from the historical record after the city was sacked during the Fourth Crusade in 1204, roughly a century and a half before the shroud resurfaces in France. It's an interesting proposed chain of custody that would, if accurate, help explain the geographic diversity turning up in the DNA data. But it remains a historical hypothesis connecting fragmentary, sometimes ambiguous medieval sources, not an established, documented chain of custody the way the shroud's post-1353 history actually is. None of that makes the underlying object any less genuinely fascinating. Layer everything together honestly. A superficial image formed through a mechanism nobody has fully and convincingly reproduced, a photographic negative-like optical property captured centuries before photography existed as a technology, a radiocarbon date resting on a sample taken from arguably the least representative corner of the entire cloth, and a genuinely diverse genetic record reflecting an extensive, complicated history of human contact that current science can document but not yet fully interpret. None of it proves anything supernatural. None of it definitively proves a forgery either. What it consistently proves, test after test, decade after decade, is that this particular object keeps resisting the kind of clean, simple resolution both true believers and confident skeptics keep hoping the next study will finally provide. So the honest, current scientific position isn't a triumphant reveal in either direction. It's closer to this. The Shroud of Turin remains one of the most intensively studied physical objects on the planet, and the more thoroughly modern instruments examine it, the the more genuinely complicated, rather than simpler, the underlying story becomes. The DNA isn't a birth certificate proving whose body once lay beneath that linen. It's a partial, imperfect record of the enormous number of hands that have touched this specific piece of cloth across roughly 6 documented centuries, and quite possibly longer, read through a scientific method that's honest enough to admit its own real limitations. Knowing all of that, the more interesting question probably isn't whether any single test, DNA, radiocarbon, or some future method not yet invented, will ever fully settle this debate. It's whether an object this thoroughly, repeatedly studied, and still this genuinely unresolved, might simply be destined to stay exactly what it's been for over a century now. The rare case where more research keeps producing less certainty rather than more.